Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, after days of silence, James finally returns to the little thatched house where Diep and Nhi have been waiting with aching hearts. What begins as a quiet night under the oil lamp turns into a reunion filled with tears, relief, and the kind of love that survives distance and uncertainty. But it doesn't stop there. The next morning, the three of them step into the yard together, planting fresh rows of vegetables, cooking side by side, and sharing a dinner overflowing with laughter. Stay until the end, because this chapter reveals not just a reunion, but a promise of a future built with both hands and honest love. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us. The thatched house glows softly under the early evening light, the warm yellow from a small oil lamp flickering against the woven bamboo walls. In the kitchen corner, Diep stirs a pan of fragrant fried rice, the scent of scallions and egg filling the entire room. At the little wooden table, Nhi swings her legs back and forth, cheeks puffed as she chews happily. "Good, baby?" Diep asks gently. Nhi nods fast, mouth full. "Yes, yummy." Diep smiles, scoops another spoonful of egg, blows lightly, and feeds it to her one bite at a time. The child's laughter mixes with the crackling of the stove, creating a kind of warmth only a small family can understand. When the meal is done, Diep lifts Nhi into her arms and carries her to the old bamboo bed. It creaks softly under their weight. Nhi rubs her eyes, whispering, "Sleepy." "I know, sweetheart," Diep murmurs, tucking the blanket around her tiny body. She hums a lullaby, voice warm but trembling slightly. Just as Nhi begins drifting into sleep, she murmurs in that half-dreaming voice only children have, "I miss Uncle James so much." Diep pauses. Her song falters. She leans down, kisses Nhi's forehead, and a quiet tear slips down her cheek, landing beside her daughter's pillow. Outside, crickets chirp in steady rhythm. The small house settles into silence, holding nothing but the slow turning of the fan and the steady breathing of a child who still believes her family will be whole again. Hours later, long past midnight, a sputtering motorbike breaks the silence of the alley. Diep jolts upright, instinct guiding her legs as she rushes toward the door. The pale moonlight stretches across the front yard like a silver blanket. And there, at the gate, James climbs unsteadily off his motorbike. His shirt is dusty, one pant leg torn, and his knee scraped raw. "James!" She runs to him, not caring about the mud beneath her bare feet. The moment she reaches him, her arms wrapped tight around his waist, her voice breaking. "You're back. You're finally back." James tries to laugh but winces. "I'm okay. Well, mostly. I fell on the way, but I had to come home." Diep cups his face, scanning him with frantic eyes. "Why didn't you call? You scared me to death." "My phone died halfway here," he says softly, brushing her hair behind her ear. "And I didn't want you or Nhi to worry more." She pulls him to sit on the front step, her hands trembling as she examines his knee. James catches her wrist gently. "I'm here now," he whispers. For a moment, neither speaks. The cold wind carries the distant aroma of roasted sweet potatoes from a neighbor's yard, blending with the damp smell of the earth after a chilly night. Diep leans into him, resting her cheek against his shoulder, tears soaking quietly into his worn shirt. After so many days of fear, longing, and unanswered questions, his presence feels like warmth pouring back into a frozen room. Inside, the oil lamp sways as if welcoming him home. Later, when James is finally resting, Diep sits on the small bamboo mat with an old notebook on her lap. The dim lamp casts soft shadows over the pages filled with numbers and calculations. She chews the end of the pen, brows knitted tightly. 20 million, minus transport, minus sacks, minus labor. Line after line gets crossed out until only a thin sliver of profit remains. 5 million, Diep whispers to herself. After all that work, she exhales long, shoulders sagging in disappointment. Out in the yard, only a few small potato plants remain, fragile and barely surviving the cold. She steps outside, kneels beside them, her fingers brushing over the wilted leaves. "Don't die," she murmurs. "Just hold on until the harvest. Please." There's a sadness in her voice, a weight she carries alone. James stirs on the bed, turning slowly, and she watches him for a long moment. The thought of everything he's been through, the distance he crossed to come home, mixes with the guilt she feels about the struggling crops and the business that never quite works out. But tonight she refuses to drown in worry. He's back. And tomorrow, they will figure out each problem together. Dawn arrives gently. Soft golden light slips through the cracks in the wall, painting the house in warm stripes. Diep nudges Nhi awake. "Rise and shine, princess. Time to brush teeth." Still bleary-eyed, Nhi reaches for her toothbrush. "Mama, look. I can do it by myself." She brushes with determination, splashing water everywhere, then beams with pride. Diep laughs quietly. "Good job, but remember, wash your hands first, or bacteria will get in your eyes." Nhi nods seriously, like it's the most important lesson in the world. When they finish, the three of them step into the yard together. James stretches, wincing when the pull tugs at his injured knee. "You should rest," Diep says, frowning. James shakes his head with a playful grin. "No way. Today, we're going to plant vegetables." Diep blinks. "What?" "You've been carrying the whole burden alone," he continues, rolling up his sleeves. "From today on, we do everything together. No more suffering in silence. No more crying alone at night. I'm here, Diep. I'm really here." For the first time in days, her heart feels light. James shows Nhi how to dig little holes, and the child laughs each time the soil crumbles between her fingers. Diep kneels beside them, handing seedlings one by one. The morning sun warms their backs, and a tender breeze rustles through the papaya trees behind the house. The yard, usually quiet and burdened, suddenly feels alive. As they work, James glances at Diep. "I missed this, all of it. You, Nhi, even this mess of a yard." Diep laughs, wiping sweat from her forehead. "It's not a mess." "Well," he teases, "it will be a garden after I finish helping." She rolls her eyes, but can't hide her smile. They plant row after row together, hands touching soil, rhythm falling naturally into sync, as if they were never apart at all. When the sun sits high overhead, James dusts off his hands. "All right, chef," he grins. "What's for dinner tonight?" Diep raises an eyebrow. "Chef? Since when am I the chef?" Since I'm injured, he points dramatically at his weak knee, so obviously I can't cook. Nhi giggles loudly. Diep shakes her head. Fine, but you're helping. Yes, ma'am. They laugh their way into the kitchen, and for the first time in a long while, the house feels full. Full of footsteps, full of laughter, full of the kind of peace only family can create together. Inside the little kitchen, sunlight pours through the window, turning drifting dust into tiny golden sparks. James stands beside Diep at the counter, still limping a little, but determined to help. Hand me the garlic, Diep says. James picks up the wrong bowl. That's ginger. Oh, right. Nhi bursts into giggles, clutching her belly as if her father's confusion is the funniest thing in the world. James puts a hand on his chest. My own daughter laughing at me? Because you don't know anything, she squeals. Diep shakes her head with mock sternness. See what you've missed while you were gone? She's grown into a whole comedian. They start preparing dinner together, moving around the small kitchen like 3 puzzle pieces finally falling back into place. Diep washes vegetables at the clay sink, while James slices tomatoes. Too thick at first, then way too thin. Let me, Diep sighs, laughing as she takes the knife. Hey, I'm learning, James defends himself. That's what worries me, she teases. He bumps her shoulder lightly with his. You're cruel, and you love it. He doesn't deny it. While Diep sautés the vegetables, James gently lifts Nhi onto the counter so she can sprinkle a little salt and pepper. The child beams with pride, eyes sparkling when Diep praises her. You're the best helper Mama's ever had. And Papa too, Nhi announces. James straightens. Exactly, I'm assistant number 1. Diep raises an eyebrow. Okay, fine, he amends. Assistant number 2. The kitchen fills with the warm smells of garlic, tofu, and simmering broth. Pots bubble softly, and the faint crackling of frying onions creates a peaceful rhythm. Dinner is simple. Stir-fried greens, a small pot of soup, braised tofu. But tonight, it feels like a feast. They lay everything out on the wooden table. Nhi hops into her seat, legs kicking excitedly. Diep ladles soup into bowls. Careful, it's hot. James blows on his spoon exaggeratedly, making Nhi laugh again. For a moment, they eat quietly, savoring the warmth of the meal. Then, James sets down his chopsticks and reaches across the table to take Diep's hand. Thank you. She looks up, puzzled. For what? For holding everything together while I was gone. For being strong. For raising our daughter so well. For waiting for me to come home. Diep's throat tightens. She tries to pull her hand away, embarrassed by the emotion rising in her chest. But James holds on gently. You don't have to carry everything alone anymore. I'm here now. No more disappearing. No more leaving you to fight battles by yourself. Her vision blurs. You promise? She whispers. James nods. I do. I'm home, Diep. Nhi, not fully understanding, but sensing the depth of the moment, reaches out and hugs both their arms. Family hug. James pulls her into his lap, and Diep leans over, pressing her forehead against her daughter's. The 3 of them share a long, quiet embrace, the kind that stitches something broken back together. After dinner, Diep washes dishes while James wipes down the table. Nhi plays outside with a small paper lantern, running in circles around the yard. She missed you every night, Diep says softly, without looking up. James stops wiping. I know. There were days she cried until she fell asleep. His jaw tightens. He sets the cloth down. I'm sorry. Diep finally turns to him, meeting his eyes. Just don't leave us again. James steps closer, places a hand on her shoulder. I won't. I'm building everything here now, with you. Outside, Nhi's laughter rises into the dusk. The first stars appear behind thin clouds, and crickets begin their nightly chorus. When the dishes are done, James steps out into the yard, where Nhi is drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick. What are you making, sweetheart? A house, she says proudly. A house for us, with a garden, and chickens, and a swing. James kneels beside her. A swing, huh? Nhi nods vigorously. Papa will push me. Diep watches from the doorway, a soft smile forming. James picks Nhi up and spins her in a slow circle, careful not to hurt his injured knee. She shrieks with joy. Diep steps forward quickly. Careful, James laughs. Relax, I've got her. Nhi wraps her arms around his neck. Papa's strong. James winks at Diep. See? She believes in me. Diep folds her arms. I'll believe it when you stop tripping over your own feet. As night deepens, they return inside. Diep prepares a warm basin for Nhi to wash her hands and feet. James dries her hair with a small towel, gently rubbing in circles. Papa, softer. You're shaking my brain. Diep nearly doubles over laughing. James looks betrayed. Even you laugh at me. First my daughter, now my wife. The moment he says, my wife, Diep freezes for half a second. James notices, but pretends not to, continuing to dry Nhi's hair until she's giggling again. When bedtime comes, Diep tucks Nhi under the blanket. James sits on the edge of the bed, humming a tune he once sang to her before leaving. Nhi snuggles close to Diep and whispers sleepily, Papa came back. I'm happy. Diep strokes her hair. Sleep, my love. James kisses Nhi's forehead. Good night, princess. Within minutes, the child's breathing slows into a peaceful rhythm. They step outside quietly, leaving the door slightly ajar. The moon hangs low, casting a silver glow across the yard. Diep stands, with her arms wrapped around herself. James approaches and gently drapes his jacket over her shoulders. Cold? A little. He stands beside her, eyes following the rows of freshly planted vegetables. They'll grow fast, he says. Only if we take good care of them, Diep replies softly. James glances at her. Then we will. The night breeze carries the scent of damp earth and new beginnings. Diep exhales slowly, letting the peace of the moment sink into her bones. James reaches for her hand. She doesn't pull away this time. I know I've made mistakes, he says quietly. But I want to build a real future here, with you and Nhi. I want a garden, a swing, maybe even chickens. Everything she dreamed of. Diep turns to him, searching his face. And what do you dream of? James squeezes her hand gently. You. The word hangs in the air, simple and honest. Diep lowers her gaze. Then stay. Stay for good. I will, James promises. From now on, every sunrise, every meal, every garden bed, we do it together. A soft warmth spreads through her chest. She steps closer until her head rests lightly on his shoulder. For the first time in so long, Diep doesn't feel alone. The moon moves slowly across the sky, The oil lamp flickers inside the house. Somewhere beyond the fields, a dog barks, and the village settles into quiet.